There is a story people tell themselves after being left by an avoidant partner, one that gets repeated so often, it starts to feel like established fact. The story that the attraction simply faded, that whatever spark once existed quietly dimmed until nothing remained worth staying for. This story is comforting in its own strange way because it locates the ending somewhere external, in a feeling that either exists or doesn't, something neither person had much control over. What this story almost always gets wrong is the actual mechanism behind the ending, because attraction, in most cases involving an avoidant partner, was never really the thing that disappeared. What disappeared was something else entirely, something considerably more specific and considerably more revealing about what actually happened, and understanding this distinction changes almost everything about how the ending gets understood. If the listener has spent time replaying a relationship's final months, searching for the moment attraction supposedly evaporated, trying to identify what changed about their own appearance, personality, or behavior that might explain why an avoidant partner grew distant, this exploration is going to offer a different, considerably more accurate explanation, one that has almost nothing to do with attraction and almost everything to do with something the avoidant themselves rarely understands well enough to name clearly. To understand this distinction, it helps to understand what capacity actually means in the context of sustaining a close relationship, because it's a different quality entirely from attraction, desire, or even love itself. Capacity refers to someone's actual ability to tolerate and sustain the ongoing demands of genuine intimacy, the vulnerability required, the consistent emotional availability, the willingness to stay present through conflict rather than retreating from it, the tolerance for being truly known rather than performing a curated, safer version of oneself. This capacity isn't fixed or universal. It varies enormously between people, shaped heavily by earlier life experiences, and for many avoidants, this capacity was compromised long before they ever met the person they eventually pulled away from, formed through years of learning that closeness itself carried risk too significant to fully embrace. This is worth naming directly because it reframes an ending that so often gets misread as a verdict on the person left behind. An avoidant partner withdrawing doesn't necessarily mean they found someone less attractive, less interesting, less worthy of genuine connection than they'd initially believed. It often means they encountered the exact demands genuine intimacy requires, and their own capacity, built through circumstances entirely outside the other person's control, simply wasn't sufficient to meet those demands sustainably, regardless of how genuinely attracted they remained throughout. It's worth exploring why this distinction gets so consistently missed, both by the person left behind and often by the avoidant themselves. Most people, when a relationship ends through slow withdrawal rather than dramatic conflict, naturally search for a specific, identifiable cause, and attraction offers a deceptively simple explanation that requires no deeper examination of anything more complicated. It's much easier, in the immediate aftermath of loss, to believe that some spark simply faded than to understand that a partner's capacity for sustained intimacy was genuinely limited in ways that had little to do with anything the other person did or didn't do. This simpler explanation, however, comes at a real cost because it typically produces intense self-scrutiny, an exhaustive search for personal flaws that might explain the withdrawal when the actual explanation likely had almost nothing to do with anything within the listener's control. There's something worth naming plainly here for the listener currently caught in this exact search, replaying old memories, wondering what specifically changed to make an avoidant partner grow distant. It's worth considering that the timing of withdrawal in avoidant relationships often correlates far more reliably with increasing closeness and intimacy than with any decrease in attraction. This pattern shows up so consistently across avoidant relationships that it deserves to be understood as a genuine, predictable signal rather than a coincidence specific to any one relationship. As intimacy deepens, as vulnerability increases, as the relationship moves from its earlier, more manageable stages into something requiring sustained emotional presence, an avoidance capacity often reaches its actual limit, not because attraction has diminished, but because the relationship has simply asked for more than that capacity was ever built to provide. It's worth exploring what this capacity limitation actually looks like from the inside, because understanding the internal experience can help clarify why withdrawal so often gets misread as declining interest. An avoidant approaching the edge of their genuine capacity for closeness typically doesn't experience this limitation as a clear, articulable thought, something like recognizing consciously that they can't handle any more intimacy. It shows up instead as a vague, uncomfortable restlessness, an unexplainable irritability, a growing desire for distance that doesn't come with any obvious explanation attached. This is precisely why avoidant withdrawal so often looks, from the outside, like waning interest, because the avoidant themselves frequently cannot identify what's actually happening internally, defaulting instead to explanations that feel more concrete, sometimes genuinely believing, at least temporarily, that something about the relationship or the partner has simply stopped working for them. This is worth sitting with directly because it explains a specific, painful pattern many people experience. Watching an avoidant partner offer reasons for the relationship's ending that feel disconnected from anything that actually seem to be happening in real time. Vague complaints about compatibility, general statements about needing space or time to figure things out. Sometimes, painfully, direct claims that attraction or feelings have simply faded. These explanations often aren't deliberate deception. They're the avoidant's genuine, if inaccurate, attempt to articulate an internal experience they don't fully understand themselves, reaching for language that sounds more definitive and more externally focused than the murkier, less comfortable truth of having simply reached the limits of their own capacity for sustained closeness. It's worth examining what actually builds or limits this capacity in the first place, because understanding its origins helps clarify why it functions so differently from attraction, which tends to remain relatively stable once genuinely established. Capacity for intimacy develops primarily through early attachment experiences, through whether closeness with caregivers in childhood felt safe, consistent, and reliably met with warmth, or whether it felt unpredictable, conditional, or sometimes actively punished. These early experiences shape a nervous system's baseline tolerance for vulnerability long before adult romantic relationships ever enter the picture. And this baseline, while not entirely fixed or unchangeable, tends to remain relatively stable without significant, deliberate effort toward growth, often requiring therapy or sustained self-reflective work that many avoidants never fully undertake, at least not within the timeline of any single relationship. There's a specific implication worth naming here for the listener trying to make sense of what this means for their own experience of the relationship's ending. If capacity rather than attraction was the actual limiting factor, this means the relationship's ending likely had very little to do with anything specific to the listener as a person, their appearance, their personality, their worth as a partner. It had to do with a structural limitation the avoidant carried into the relationship from the very beginning, one that would likely have produced a similar outcome in almost any relationship that progressed toward genuine, sustained intimacy, regardless of who the specific partner happened to be. This reframing doesn't eliminate the pain of the ending, but it does redirect that pain away from self-blame and toward a more accurate understanding of what actually happened. It's worth exploring too how this distinction between attraction and capacity plays out in what often happens after the relationship ends, because avoidant partners frequently continue expressing genuine, ongoing attraction and affection even after withdrawing completely, a pattern that becomes considerably easier to understand once capacity and attraction are recognized as separate, independent qualities. An avoidant ex-partner reaching out months later, still expressing genuine care or lingering feelings, isn't necessarily lying about having felt real attraction throughout the relationship. What they're demonstrating, often without recognizing it themselves, is that the withdrawal was never really about attraction fading. It was about capacity reaching its limit within the specific structure and pace that particular relationship demanded, a limitation that distance and time apart can sometimes temporarily ease, precisely because distance removes the ongoing demand for sustained closeness that originally exceeded what their capacity could provide. This is worth naming carefully because it explains a confusing and often painful pattern many people experience. An avoidant who withdrew from a relationship's demands for closeness while it existed, only to express renewed warmth and even longing once genuine distance has been established. This isn't necessarily evidence that the avoidant was lying about their earlier withdrawal, nor is it necessarily evidence that reconciliation would now succeed where it failed before. It's simply further confirmation that capacity, not attraction, was always the actual variable at play, and capacity, unless it has genuinely been addressed through the kind of internal work described earlier, tends to reach the same limits again once any renewed relationship progresses back toward the same level of sustained closeness that originally exceeded what the avoidant could provide. It's worth exploring what this understanding means practically for the listener moving forward, both in processing this specific relationship's ending and in approaching future relationships with clearer expectations. Recognizing that capacity, not attraction, determines an avoidant partner's ability to sustain closeness, shifts the relevant question away from whether someone finds a partner attractive enough to stay, and toward whether that partner has actually developed sufficient capacity through genuine internal work to sustain the specific demands of real intimacy. This is a considerably more useful question to ask early in any relationship, because capacity, unlike attraction, tends to reveal itself through observable patterns: how someone handles vulnerability, how they respond to conflict, whether they can tolerate being truly known without needing to create distance once things move beyond the relationship's easier, earlier stages. There's a specific dimension worth exploring here concerning how capacity differs from willingness, because these two qualities often get conflated in ways that produce unnecessary confusion and additional pain for the person trying to understand an avoidant partner's withdrawal. Willingness implies a conscious choice, a deliberate decision about whether to invest further in a relationship. Capacity operates on a different level entirely, closer to an actual ceiling on what someone's nervous system can sustainably tolerate, regardless of how genuinely willing they might be, in a purely intentional sense, to stay present and engaged. An avoidant partner can be completely sincere in wanting to remain close, can genuinely wish they were capable of tolerating the vulnerability required, while still finding themselves unable to sustain that closeness once it reaches a certain threshold, not because they've chosen distance over connection, but because their actual capacity simply hasn't developed enough to make sustained connection possible without triggering an overwhelming need to retreat. It's worth examining how this distinction plays out in the specific behaviors that so often get misread as declining interest. An avoidant partner who becomes suddenly busier, who initiates contact less frequently, who seems distracted during previously enjoyable shared activities, is often not consciously choosing to invest less because attraction has faded. They're responding to an internal alarm system that has been triggered by increasing closeness, an alarm system operating largely outside their conscious awareness or control. This means the withdrawal, however painful and confusing to witness, frequently isn't a reflection of deliberate choice at all. It's closer to an automatic protective reflex, similar to how someone might flinch away from an unexpected touch, regardless of whether they consciously wanted to pull back. There's something worth naming about how this distinction between capacity and willingness connects to a common painful question many people ask themselves after this kind of ending. Why didn't they just try harder? This question assumes that trying harder was simply a matter of decision, that sufficient motivation or sufficient care would have been enough to override whatever was causing the distance. Capacity, unlike willingness, doesn't respond straightforwardly to increased motivation or increased care. Someone whose nervous system genuinely lacks the capacity to sustain deep intimacy cannot simply decide to develop that capacity through sheer effort or good intentions alone, any more than someone with a genuine phobia can simply decide, through willpower alone, to no longer feel afraid. Building capacity typically requires sustained, deliberate work, often extending over years, frequently benefiting significantly from professional support, and this work operates on an entirely different timeline than the timeline any single relationship's demands might allow for. It's worth exploring too how capacity tends to fluctuate somewhat even within a single avoidant person's life, rather than remaining perfectly fixed and unchanging across every circumstance and relationship. Someone's capacity for closeness can be affected by external stresses entirely unrelated to the relationship itself, career pressure, family obligations, unresolved grief, physical health difficulties, any of which can temporarily reduce an already limited capacity even further. This means the specific timing of an avoidant partner's withdrawal sometimes correlates as much with external life circumstances as it does with the relationship's own internal progression toward deeper intimacy, adding another layer of complexity that makes it even less accurate to attribute the withdrawal to any failing on the part of the person left behind. There's a particular pattern worth naming here regarding how capacity limitations sometimes produce a specific kind of oscillation within relationships that haven't yet reached their final ending. Periods of genuine closeness, followed by withdrawal, followed by renewed closeness, once some space has been re-established, in a cycle that can repeat many times before an eventual, more permanent ending occurs. This oscillation often confuses both people involved because the periods of genuine closeness feel real and meaningful, seeming to contradict the subsequent withdrawal in ways that make the whole pattern difficult to understand as a single, coherent story. Understanding capacity as the underlying mechanism helps make sense of this oscillation because it reveals both phases as genuine, not contradictory. Real closeness happening within the boundaries of what current capacity could sustain, followed by withdrawal once that capacity's threshold gets reached and needs time to reset before closeness can be tolerated again. It's worth examining what factors tend to actually expand someone's capacity for intimacy over time, because this matters for anyone wondering whether an avoidant partner's limitations might eventually change, whether within a current relationship or in some future one. Genuine expansion of capacity typically requires several specific conditions working together. Consistent experiences of safety that gradually teach the nervous system that vulnerability doesn't inevitably lead to the negative outcomes it learned to expect earlier in life. Active, deliberate engagement with therapy or other reflective work, rather than passive hope that time alone will produce change, and genuine motivation coming from the avoidant's own internal desire for growth, rather than motivation borrowed entirely from fear of losing a specific relationship. Without these conditions present together, capacity tends to remain relatively static, meaning a relationship that has already reached and repeatedly tested its current limits is unlikely to suddenly expand those limits without some meaningful, deliberate shift in how the avoidant partner is actively working on their own patterns. There's something worth naming about how this understanding of capacity applies not just to romantic relationships, but extends into how avoidants navigate closeness more broadly, across friendships, family relationships, and even professional collaborations that require sustained trust and vulnerability. Recognizing capacity as a general cross-domain quality rather than something specific to romantic attraction can help clarify that an avoidant partner's withdrawal genuinely reflects something about their own broader relational patterns that likely show up to varying degrees across many different relationships in their life, rather than something uniquely triggered by the specific dynamics of this one particular partnership. It's worth exploring, finally, what this reframing means for how the listener might approach evaluating future relationships, because understanding capacity as distinct from attraction offers a genuinely useful diagnostic tool going forward, rather than focusing primarily on how attracted a new partner seems, or how intensely they express interest in the relationship's early stages. It becomes considerably more useful to observe how that partner handles increasing vulnerability over time, whether they remain present and engaged as intimacy deepens, or whether familiar patterns of withdrawal begin emerging once the relationship moves past its easier, more superficial early stages. This observation, sustained patiently over enough time to actually reveal a pattern, tends to provide far more reliable information about a relationship's long-term viability than attraction alone, however strong that attraction initially feels, could ever manage to provide on its own. It's worth naming too a specific misunderstanding that often complicates how people interpret an avoidant's stated reasons for leaving, particularly when those reasons involve language about needing independence or feeling suffocated. These complaints, however genuinely felt in the moment they're expressed, frequently describe the experience of approaching a capacity limit rather than accurately diagnosing what the relationship itself actually required. A relationship that felt suffocating to an avoidant partner wasn't necessarily objectively excessive in its demands for closeness. It may have simply asked for a completely ordinary, reasonable level of intimacy that exceeded what this particular person's current capacity could comfortably sustain. This distinction matters considerably for anyone left wondering whether they were somehow too much, too needy, too demanding, when in reality the relationship may have required nothing more than the kind of consistent presence and emotional availability that most healthy relationships naturally require in order to function and grow. There's something worth exploring about how this capacity framework helps explain a particularly painful and disorienting pattern some people encounter, watching an avoidant partner go on to sustain a seemingly healthier relationship with someone new, at least based on outward appearances observed from a distance. This observation often produces intense self-doubt, the assumption that if the avoidant could manage closeness with someone else, the earlier withdrawal must have been specifically about something lacking in the original partner rather than about the avoidant's own limited capacity. This assumption deserves careful, honest examination rather than automatic acceptance, because outward appearances of a new relationship rarely reveal its actual internal dynamics, and it's entirely possible, even common, for an avoidant partner to appear more successful in a subsequent relationship simply because that relationship hasn't yet progressed far enough to test the same capacity limits that the previous relationship eventually reached. What looks, from the outside, like successful, sustained closeness may simply be a relationship still operating within the boundaries the avoidance capacity can currently tolerate. Boundaries that haven't yet been pushed toward the deeper vulnerability that eventually revealed the limitation in the previous relationship. It's worth examining as well how children complicate this entire framework when they're part of a longer relationship's history, because parenting introduces its own specific demands for emotional availability and consistency that can interact with an avoidant partner's existing capacity limitations in particularly complex ways. An avoidant parent may find that the demands of raising children, demands that require sustained emotional presence, regardless of one's own internal comfort level, either forces some degree of capacity expansion out of necessity, or alternatively produces additional strain that further limits whatever capacity remained available for the romantic partnership itself. Recognizing this added layer of complexity can help explain patterns that might otherwise seem confusing. An avoidant parent who manages reasonably well with children while struggling considerably more with the specific demands of romantic intimacy, or conversely, someone whose capacity limitations show up even more starkly once parenting responsibilities are added to an already limited baseline capacity for sustained closeness. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how this understanding of capacity should inform, though not necessarily determine, decisions about whether to remain in contact or attempt reconciliation with an avoidant partner after an initial ending. Understanding that capacity, rather than attraction, was the limiting factor doesn't automatically mean that patient waiting for capacity to expand represents a wise or sustainable path forward. Capacity expansion, when it happens at all, typically requires the specific conditions named earlier: genuine internal motivation, active engagement with reflective work, consistent experiences of safety, conditions that a relationship already strained by repeated withdrawal often struggles to provide precisely because the strain itself works against the safety and stability capacity building actually requires. This means understanding the accurate cause of the ending doesn't necessarily change the practical calculation about whether continuing to invest in that specific relationship represents a wise use of one's own limited time and emotional energy. It's worth exploring, finally, how this entire framework connects to broader questions about self-worth that extend well beyond any single relationship's specific history. Many people, upon learning to distinguish capacity from attraction, experience genuine relief at finally having an accurate explanation for an ending that previously felt inexplicable or self-incriminating. This relief deserves to be honoured and trusted, but it's also worth pairing with an honest acknowledgement that self-worth shouldn't have been contingent on this specific explanation in the first place. A person's value as a partner was never actually determined by whether a specific avoidant person's limited capacity happened to be sufficient to sustain a relationship with them. Understanding the accurate mechanism behind the ending offers valuable clarity and appropriate relief from misplaced self-blame, but the deeper, more durable foundation of self-worth ideally rests on something considerably more stable than any single relationship's outcome. However, that outcome is ultimately explained or understood. The pain of being left by someone whose attraction, by their own account or by external appearance, seemed to simply fade, is real and deserves acknowledgement, regardless of the more accurate underlying explanation this exploration has traced. But that pain doesn't have to remain permanently attached to the mistaken belief that something about the listener personally caused that fading. Understanding that capacity, not attraction, was the actual limiting factor offers something valuable beyond simple comfort. It offers accuracy, a clearer, more honest picture of what actually happened, one that removes an unnecessary and undeserved burden of self-blame from an ending that, in truth, likely had far less to do with the listener than it ever appeared to at the time. There's one final distinction worth carrying forward from everything this exploration has traced, because it tends to matter regardless of whether the relationship in question ever resumes or remains fully in the past. Attraction, real as it may have been, was never actually the currency this relationship's survival depended on. Capacity was, and capacity belonged entirely to the avoidant partner, shaped by a history that predates the relationship itself and existing largely outside anything the listener said, did, or could have done differently. This means the ending, however painful, was never really a referendum on desirability, worth, or lovability. It was simply the honest, if painful, revelation of a limit that existed long before this particular relationship began, and would very likely have appeared in almost any relationship that asked the same avoidant partner to sustain the same depth of closeness over the same extended period of time. Carrying this understanding forward doesn't erase the grief of what was lost, but it does offer something worth holding on to in its place. A foundation built on accuracy rather than on the quiet corrosive assumption that something about being loved less was ever really the true story here at all. That accuracy matters more than it might initially seem to, because stories built on inaccurate self-blame tend to follow people quietly into future relationships, shaping expectations and eroding confidence in ways that have nothing to do with what actually happened the first time around. Replacing that inaccurate story with a truer one, however less flattering it might feel in the moment to admit that someone else's limitations, not one's own shortcomings, determined how things unfolded, tends to clear real space for something considerably healthier and more genuine to finally take root in whatever comes next.